castles European slave traders built in the whole of West Africa. So that's the reason that all the three slave castles Europeans built in West Africa are all located in Ghana. These three slave castles are Elmina Slave Castle, Osu Slave Castle, and Cape Coast Slave Castle. The Portuguese built the Elmina Castle in 1482. The Danes established Osu Castle in 1661, and the British built Cape Coast Slave Castle in 1664. That means that Cape Coast Castle is the youngest slave castle. But Cape Coast Slave Castle, which is the youngest, is 358 years old. Elmina Castle is the biggest and the oldest slave castle, and that is 541 years old. Here at Cape Coast Slave Castle are two dungeons, the male dungeon and the female dungeon. In the male slave dungeon were as many as 1,000 enslaved African men. In the female dungeon were as many as 500 enslaved African women. The dungeons are very horrible. But what actually brought the Europeans here, the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade, we need to know what happened. Now, the first group of people to come to Africa to take the Africans were the Arabs. But the Arabs came across a desert we call Sahara Desert. They came for gold, ivory, spices, and many Africans to the Middle East. However, the Arabs castrated all the African men they took there. The reason is because they didn't want black people to reproduce over there. So many African men bladed in that painful moment till they died. It was around that same time that the Arabs were trading with the Europeans. They were giving the Europeans the gold they were getting from the Africans. It got to a point where the Europeans wanted to know where the Arabs were getting the gold from. And from their observation, gold was from West Africa. The first Europeans to come to West Africa were the Portuguese. But the Portuguese got to Ghana in 1471. It was around 1482 that the Portuguese built the Elmina Slave Castle. Now, the major difference between Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Slave Castle is that the Portuguese did not build Elmina Castle for slave trade, but the British built this one specifically to enslave the Africans. So when the Portuguese built the Elmina Castle, they didn't build dungeons, they built storages where they could store the gold they were getting from the Africans. It was after Christopher Columbus claimed he discovered the Americas in 1492. That is when those storages over there at Elmina were converted into dungeons. So that is what happened. So the Europeans began forcing the Africans to the Americas. But in 1492, Christopher Columbus claimed he discovered the Americas. Now, when that part of the world was discovered, the Europeans realized that they could cultivate sugar cane to produce sugar. Sugar was very expensive. So the Europeans began forcing the Native Americans as cheap labors. But due to the fact that the Europeans introduced many diseases that killed them, there was a priest, a Catholic priest called Bartolomeo de las Casas. He recommended that the Europeans should come for West Africans to the Americas. That the West Africans are very strong people. They are very strong and they can work on the sugarcane plantations. And that was the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to take you to the dungeons. I'm going to show you real slave dungeons, how our ancestors were being treated when they were held in these dungeons. This is a very brief introduction.